How you doing? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. The news was splashed across the country May 31st when police in Atlanta arrested 3 leaders of the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, which supported protesters of the city's proposed police and fire training center. Investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation say they found evidence linking the trio of leaders to financial crimes, including money laundering and charity fraud. Now, that's how the story was presented in most news outlets, but this is more than just a simple arrest. A SWAT team was deployed to arrest and jail the board members of a charity, leadership positions that come with distinct legal protections. It's also unusual for a state Bureau of Investigation to head the prosecution of charity fraud as a criminal matter. Instead, this is coming across as an effort of a state to stifle protest by going against a group's financial supporters. We're joined today by Professor Beth Gazley, who's a world-renowned expert in U.S. nonprofit management and civil society policy. She has published more than 85 research articles, books, and commentary addressing intersectoral collaboration, volunteerism, nonprofit governance, public service co-production, association management, disaster response, and other topics. Beth, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for being here. I'm glad to be here.
First off, could you just walk us through some of the basics of this situation? I ran down a little bit in the introduction, but if you could just walk us through.
Well, Atlanta has had a historically troubled police department, and they've done a number of trainings over the years in rented facilities across the city, and it just seemed to make sense to them to build a police public safety and training facility that would also be used for fire training, but is mainly being used for police training. And the facility involves the creation, actually, of a fake city, and that's where the name Cop City comes from. It's in the middle of one of the nation's really largest urban forests. And the controversy began not only because of the price tag, which is going to probably amount to more than $90 million in the end, but also because of the the environmental degradation that might be involved. People are concerned about misplaced priorities, and then a lot of people within Atlanta are concerned also about over-policing and police overreach. And they don't think an urban training center is in their best interests. Atlanta also has a Network for Strong Communities. This is the charity in the middle of the controversy right now. The Network for Strong Communities is a very innocuous-sounding name for an organization that does a lot of community organizing of various kinds, mostly supporting progressive causes. And they maintain the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. The Atlanta Solidarity Fund is your normal, kind of common bail bond fund. The bail funds have a long and storied history in this country as a way of alleviating the hardship of people being held in pretrial detention. They're innocent until proven guilty, but they're in pretrial detention and can't swing the cost of a bail. And that's where legal defense funds and bail funds help them out.
What disturbs you the most about the way this situation is being handled?
Well, it's really unusual. I think people who've been watching this unfold over time, and I should mention that I have a personal connection to these events because a friend of mine has been one of the environmental activists who's been arrested among the several dozen arrestees who've been arrested over the past year. And that's what brought my attention to this event. But I was also concerned about the increasing willingness of red states and conservative states to create laws and pass laws that got into the space of civil society work. And that's where my interest as a scholar comes in. So I'm a scholar of charities. Charities are an important part of civil society activity. They're considered to be a vital part of any kind of democracy. They are favored in public law. They're written into public law as organizations that we want to see thrive, particularly in the United States. So the point of connection, I think, for me, is where the board members of a legitimate charity operating in full compliance with state and federal law also become targets of police activism.
I know the board of directors have legal protections. What kind of protections are there for that?
Well, I hope they have legal protections. There is the Volunteer Protection Act, which is a federal law that's been on the books for almost 20 years now. And almost 30 years. And that was created essentially to make sure that volunteers who are acting within the scope of their responsibilities, think doctors, and medical Samaritans, they were not prosecuted or subjected to civil lawsuits by people just by virtue of being volunteers and doing their jobs. The other thing that smart boards do is they make sure that their board members have directors and officers liability insurance. That makes sure that those officers of a board, these are legal representatives of the organization with fiduciary responsibilities, right? These are trustees of public assets, charitable assets. And it makes sure that the insurance will provide for the cost of a defense should things like this happen.
Yeah. Now, in talking before the show, I know you said that the charges are based in public law, but you believe they're being applied inappropriately. Could you explain more about that?
Well, we want federal and state regulators to investigate claims of charity fraud. That's one of the charges. We want them to investigate claims of money laundering. Thankfully, those things, and to my knowledge, as best I can tell by reading the press pretty actively as I do, those are pretty rare to happen, even when they're justified. So these are things that are normally done. What's normally done is the Secretary of State, who investigates charity fraud, written right into Georgia state law, they would investigate after receiving a donor complaint. I think probably once or twice in my life I've made a donor complaint when I wondered about a charity's activities. But it's not normal for that to happen. It's very unusual for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to be leading the investigation. It's unusual for them to be arresting board members without having completed a full forensic audit of the charity and asking for documents, requesting documents. It's unusual for them also to be charged, and I think a little ignorant of them. I don't think they're going to come out of this looking very smart, because it's, I think, also unusual for them to take two activities that are very normal for charities and charity leaders and call them charity fraud and money laundering. So charity fraud happens when you deceive the donors about your activities. It does, in this case, what they've called charity fraud is board members reimbursing themselves for personal expenses. So I went out and I bought some gas, and then I went off and did some charity work. I'm allowed to legitimately reimburse myself, provided normal checks and balances happen, provided that there's good policy in place, provided the decisions are documented, and all the other things charities are expected to do. The money laundering, in this case, is a transfer of funds from one charity to another organization. That happens every day in the charitable world, right? That's how mission-related activities happen, and we encourage collaboration across charitable organizational boundaries.
Now, this is obviously a case that's changing day by day. They've already had a little bit of time in court, and even it seems that the judge is a little baffled at what the prosecutors are suggesting here. What's your take on just their response?
Well, I'm glad you picked that up, Ken. I think there's a bigger pattern here that's pretty obvious to everybody at this point in time. Throughout this past year of arrests and attempts to prosecute. And by the way, nobody's gone on trial yet, and everyone's innocent until proven guilty. Not a single person has been through a trial. The pattern is really of first of all, prosecutorial overreach. That's one thing. I think, the first thing that occurred to me when I saw this photo of a SWAT team walking into this quiet residential neighborhood and knocking on the door of a house were 3 volunteers. These are not fugitives from justice. These are not drug kingpins, okay? These are 3 volunteer board members. I was thinking about all the neighbors in the neighborhood and how chilling an effect that would have on them to see that sort of thing happening. And so the pattern has been, I think, one of overreach, another of intimidation, and the third is retaliation. And states, I think everybody should be aware that states have some very powerful laws at their disposal at this point in time. One of them is domestic terrorism laws. So some of the activists and activist organizations, not the Network for Strong Communities, but some of the others have been accused of being domestic terrorist organizations. the Department of Homeland Security and the state of Georgia don't label organizations that way. So that's just red meat for the press. They've also, one of the things the governor has done is apply a very unusual state of emergency. States of emergency happen when there's a tornado, right? Or, we need, there's some sort of maybe a terrorist event or something. They don't happen when people legally and lawfully protest. But the state of emergency does allow the governor to bring in additional armed forces if the governor needed. And this is a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, right? You're not allowed to bring in federal forces against the people of a state. The governor does have that opportunity in his pocket if he should need it. And so what seems to be happening here, really, I think from the point of view of a lot of observers, is not just a human rights violation, not just a civil rights violation, but an eye to the future. And what the state appears to be doing is trying to chill free speech and chill associational activity, which are rights of charities, as they are of you and me, and to discourage people from organizing and forming coalitions to assert their rights.
Well, when you're throwing around labels like domestic terrorism, and the people who are reading headlines see that, absorb it, and even if that is proven not true, it's in the back of their minds that this is what I read once about that. And that's what I was going to ask you about, the longer term effects. Yeah. You kind of touched on it right there, not only for Georgia, but for states beyond. This is something, it seems, that, like you said, is part of a larger pattern of a strategy, if nothing else.
Well, I think the labeling is deliberate. The slim evidence, there is a playbook out there for it, and the way the evidence has been applied has been pretty thin. I think some of the activists have been arrested for having mud on their boots in the middle of a forest. Right. So that, I think, is
how does that happen? I mean, what's illegal about mud on boots?
That's not the point of the arrest. The point of the arrest is to stop them from protesting in the first place. Okay. So you and I sit back in our comfy academic seats and we see this happening. We say, oh, we're going to stay away from Atlanta. This is a problem. And then people whom I'm not terribly sympathetic to the police position here, but I think those who are, they're going to say, oh, domestic terrorists, we don't want those kinds of people in our communities, right? Again, one of the things I have to emphasize here is this is political speech by the state of Georgia before anyone's even held a trial. And that judge, I think, it's unusual, in my opinion. I'm not a legal expert, but in my opinion, it's pretty unusual for judges to be saying, this looks pretty flimsy, people, before the trial has even been held. He had released the board members, I think just yesterday, had released them on very, very small bonds, which I think also speaks to his concern about the strength of the case.
Yeah, I want to say it's something like $15,000.
That's right.
Something
like
that. So obviously just trying to look in your crystal ball. Best case scenario of how this might play out, and worst case scenario, how it plays out, not only, again, just for this situation, but for the larger impact.
Well, I think, and I got to call myself guilty for this kind of position. I think a lot of us in the charity world have always felt we had the kind of the halo over our head, and people were not going to question the work that we did, and people were not going to challenge us. There's over 1 million charities, and many that are involved in political activity and advocacy, and whether or not I support them or not, I absolutely support their right to engage in that work. And so I think one of the things that charity observers are going to see, and I think also just normal folks who just are involved in charities, they're going to be seeing a whole different discussion about what happens when charitable work comes right up against the policies of a state and you happen to be in disagreement. And what appears to be happening here is a test case for the way states will really politicize their ability to pull back public policy, to push charities and advocacy organizations and the people behind them out of the political debate and use the repressive tactics of a police state. Let's call it what it is, to do so. And, that to me, I think the thing that worries me the most is how willing states like this are to be anti-democratic.
And there's also that extra wrinkle that already the ton of work that boards are doing for charities. Now you have this extra wrinkle of we have to plan for this and take this into consideration going forward.
Well, I do some work in some other areas that are totally unrelated to the conversation we're having now, and they're connections because if I do some research on climate change, and one of the recommendations I would make is every board of directors out there of every charity ought to be talking about the way that a changing planet is going to impact their organization. Right now, I can tell you every charity out there that's involved at all in any kind of policy-related work ought to be having a conversation with its board. But the last thing I want to happen is for them to feel that they should avoid having those conversations in the public sphere and avoid their associational rights and their free speech rights.
Well, what do you want people to understand about this case, this situation that we haven't spoken about yet?
I think I've said it all already. I think that people ought to read a variety of news sources, okay, to get at their own version of the truth. We all get to make our own create our own version of truth. And no single news source is going to give you the whole story. News sources will copy and paste material from one another, and they'll take different slants on it. And I think the smart observer of any kind of activity in a democracy, the smart observer ought to be triangulating information from a lot of sources. And that goes for any topic.
Well, I know that there are a lot of moving parts to this, and I can't thank you enough for joining us to try to help us better understand. And I hope that you'll join us, again, if sometime in the future, if this continues to play out.
Thanks, Ken.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.